What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that silenced the entire room and shattered egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables, with nothing but her talent. It was a warm Friday evening, and the hum of conversation filled the air at La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The clinking of crystal glasses, the soft shuffle of servers gliding between tables, and the distant strains of a jazz melody from the grand piano in the corner created an atmosphere of effortless luxury. At the center of it all was Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet grace and an unmistakable fire in her eyes. She moved swiftly, balancing plates and perfecting her smile, blending seamlessly into the elegant setting. To most patrons, she was just another face in uniform, a part of the well-oiled machine that ensured their evening unfolded flawlessly. But Deborah was more than a waitress. Beneath the crisp black and white uniform, beneath the practiced pleasantries, lived a dream far grander than the lavish dining room around her. Music, that was her true calling. Ever since childhood, the piano had been her sanctuary, a place where she could pour out every joy, every sorrow, and every unspoken emotion. The keys felt like an extension of her soul, and playing was as natural as breathing. But dreams don't pay the bills. Working long, grueling shifts at La Fontaine wasn't her passion. It was a means to an end. A stepping stone toward the prestigious music academy she longed to attend. Few knew about her gift, except for the restaurant staff who had, on rare occasions, caught her sneaking into the back room, fingers dancing over the battered upright piano during stolen moments on her break. And then the evening took a turn. The heavy doors swung open with an air of authority, and in walked Leonard Grayson. Instantly recognizable, the wealthy entrepreneur carried himself like he owned the room, because, in his mind, he did. Flanked by a few equally polished and self-important companions, he strode in with effortless arrogance, his sharp gaze sweeping the restaurant like a king surveying his court. Leonard thrived on spectacle. Known for his sharp tongue, his relentless need to be the center of attention, and his penchant for making people squirm, his arrival sent a ripple through the staff. Even the most seasoned waiters adjusted their posture, straightening their jackets as if bracing for impact. Deborah's colleagues exchanged wary glances. Leonard was not an easy guest. He was the kind of man who pushed people's buttons for amusement, who turned service workers into the evening's entertainment at his own expense. But to Deborah, he was just another table, another order to take, another interaction to endure before the night ended. Except, tonight would be different. As Leonard scanned the room, his gaze settled on Deborah. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in the way she moved, or the fact that she seemed utterly uninterested in his presence. For a moment he simply watched. Then came the smirk. Deborah felt the weight of his stare, a cold, assessing look that sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. But she brushed it off, focusing on refilling water glasses and clearing plates, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She had work to do. But Leonard wasn't done with her. He had already decided she was going to be his entertainment for the night. Deborah had grown up in a small town in South Carolina, a place where dreams of grandeur felt as distant as the stars. Life had never been easy, but her mother, a single parent and a tireless caregiver, had worked double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table for her and her siblings. Their means were modest, but music was always there. Her mother's old vinyl records, the slightly out-of-tune piano gifted by a kind neighbor, these were the seeds of Deborah's love for melody. That piano became her escape. While other kids played outside, she spent hours teaching herself to play. First, she mimicked songs from the radio. Then, she ventured into classical pieces she found in second-hand music books, her fingers breathing life into forgotten compositions. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. She played at church, at school recitals, at every community event that had a stage. But recognition couldn't change reality. By the time she turned 18, her path was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships didn't come through. Family responsibilities loomed larger than her ambitions. The weight of bills, rent, survival crushed the possibility of a conservatory or a prestigious academy. So Deborah did what she had to. She packed away her concert dreams and got to work. But she never truly let go. Music wasn't just a dream. It was her identity. When she moved to Raleigh a few years ago, she took a job at La Fontaine, not just for the pay but because of the grand piano that sat, untouched, in the corner of the restaurant. She rarely had time to play it, but just knowing it was there was enough. Music hadn't left her. It was simply waiting. That night, as Leonard and his entourage took their seats, Deborah approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced grace. Leonard barely glanced at the menu before ordering a top-shelf scotch, tossing in a joke loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. His voice carried, a deliberate move to draw attention. Deborah, unfazed, offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange energy radiating from him. "Deborah, huh?" Leonard mused, his eyes flicking to her name tag. Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents. The comment caught her off guard, but years of customer service had trained her well. She nodded politely and stepped away to place their orders. She didn't notice the knowing grin he exchanged with his companions, or the way his eyes followed her every move, because Leonard wasn't just observing. He was planning. And before the night was over, Deborah would find herself at the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The evening carried on like any other, the hum of laughter, the clinking of silverware, the rhythmic pace of the restaurant in full swing. Deborah kept her head down, moving between tables, keeping her pace steady. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about Leonard felt different. Not just rude. Not just entitled. Calculated. His presence loomed like a shadow, an unspoken weight pressing against her senses. Something wasn't right. And by the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already started his performance. Though not the kind Deborah expected. Leonard held court at his table, his voice cutting through the refined hum of the restaurant like a dull knife. Between sips of his expensive scotch, he loudly recounted tales of his success, punctuating each one with a condescending jab at those who lacked ambition. His entourage, ever the obedient audience, laughed dutifully at every boast. Across the room, however, other diners exchanged annoyed glances, their quiet conversations disrupted by his arrogance. Deborah, determined to ignore the spectacle, focused on her work, keeping her movements brisk and professional. But just as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard's voice sliced through the air, catching her completely off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he drawled, his tone laced with amusement. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." Deborah stopped mid-pour. For a second she hesitated. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. Then carefully she gave an answer. "I play piano sometimes," she said softly, keeping it brief, hoping to move past the moment. But Leonard's eyes lit up. A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of his lips. "A pianist, huh?" he mused. "How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" The air in the room shifted. The surrounding conversations dipped into silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy. Deborah froze. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard had no intention of letting her off the hook. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, relishing the spectacle. Other diners turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Deborah's chest tightened. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting, watching, judging. She wanted to say no. She wanted to turn away. But Leonard's challenge hung in the air, daring her to either rise to it or crumble beneath its weight. She swallowed hard. "I really shouldn't," she stammered, her gaze darting around, searching for a way out. Her colleagues, normally quick to step in, hesitated. No one wanted to challenge a man like Leonard Grayson. Leonard leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink with an almost lazy satisfaction. Then with a smirk he delivered the final blow. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words landed like a slap. Deborah's fingers clenched around the tray. She had never been one to seek confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, like she was a joke, a nobody, cut deeper than she expected. And then, somewhere in the depths of her mind, her mother's voice echoed. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A moment of silence stretched between them. Deborah glanced at the piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression dared her to take the bait. And against her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady, quiet, but unshaken. "I'll play." A ripple of anticipation coursed through the room. As Deborah stepped away from the table, making her way toward the grand piano, the dining room seemed to hold its breath. Each step carried the weight of both fear and defiance. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a gentle spotlight on the instrument, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. She slid onto the bench. Her fingers hovered over the polished keys, gleaming under the light like a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Leonard leaned back, smirking, the picture of self-satisfaction. as though he had already won. Deborah closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. This wasn't a church recital or one of the cozy community gatherings she had once known. This was different. This was hostile. But there was no turning back now. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool, smooth surface beneath her fingertips. The first notes came softly, hesitant, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats. Someone coughed in the back of the room. Deborah ignored them. Her focus sharpened as she leaned into the music. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody spilled into the air, delicate yet unyielding, wrapping itself around the room like a thread of light weaving through the darkness. And then, something shifted. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that betrayed the storm inside her. The notes poured out like a confession, raw and unfiltered. Each chord carried a piece of her story, the sacrifices her mother had made, the nights spent practicing in a cramped room with aching fingers and a determined heart, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. One by one the diners fell silent. Their earlier chatter evaporated into a hushed stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering smugly to his companions just moments ago, had gone completely quiet. Deborah didn't need to look at him to feel it, the shift in the room. The mocking energy that had clung to the air was gone, replaced by something else. Perhaps awe. Perhaps humility. The music soared, and for the first time in what felt like years, Deborah let herself go. She was no longer a waitress. No longer a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself. An artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, weaving emotions so vivid, so raw they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Then the final chord. A moment of silence. Nothing but the lingering resonance of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys. What would happen next? For a heartbeat, the entire room stood still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, thunderous applause. The room erupted, the sound crashing against the walls, filling the space with an electric warmth that Deborah had never expected. Some diners stood, clapping with such fervor it made her chest tighten. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, cheered, their faces lit with pride. Tears stung her eyes. She had never felt anything quite like this. But one person remained seated. Leonard. His smirk was gone. In its place, an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher. Shock. Discomfort? He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the roaring applause around him. But even his hesitant, reluctant acknowledgement couldn't overshadow what had just happened. Because Deborah had done something far greater than just play a song. She had reclaimed her voice. And no amount of condescension could ever take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively, as though everyone had just witnessed something profound. Deborah slowly rose from the piano bench. Her knees trembled, but her back was straight. She glanced around, and for the first time that evening she truly saw the people watching her. Not as spectators, but as witnesses. And in their eyes she saw something new. Admiration. Respect. Even a hint of awe. She didn't look at Leonard right away. Instead, she turned to the diners who had clapped the loudest, offering them a small, polite nod. And as she did, a faint smile curved at the edges of her lips. It wasn't pride Deborah felt, it was relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. Relief that, in a moment designed to diminish her, she had found her voice instead. But then, as if magnetized, her gaze shifted back to Leonard. He was still seated, his hands clasped together on the table. The confident smirk he had worn so brazenly earlier? Gone. Instead, his face was a mask of forced neutrality, as though he couldn't decide whether to admit his misstep or double down on his arrogance. Finally, Leonard broke the silence. Well, he said, his voice louder than necessary, cutting through the fragile quiet that had settled over the room. That was unexpected. He chuckled lightly, but the bravado was gone. I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places. The words landed like a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to be an olive branch, but they were hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly own the moment. Thank you, Deborah said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. She wasn't going to let him pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose on her. Her performance had spoken louder than any rebuttal she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably as he felt the weight of the room's collective gaze pressing down on him. He lifted a hand toward the waiter, signaling for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he added, almost begrudgingly. Deborah nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she replied, her voice deliberate, measured. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room held its breath again. Her words weren't loud. They weren't aggressive. But they were enough. Leonard shifted in his seat. His usual air of dominance was slipping, fast. The diners, once enthralled by his presence, had turned their attention back to their meals. But the energy in the room? Completely different. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer. A shared understanding. Perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Leonard wasn't just humiliated. He was exposed. And no amount of charm could shield him from the truth. Everyone in the room now saw him for who he really was. Deborah stepped away from the piano. The weight of the moment settled in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish. But something about her posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher. Her movements were more deliberate. At Leonard's table, the energy had shifted completely. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact. Their conversation was subdued, their confidence evaporated. Where there had once been loud, boisterous bravado, there was now only an awkward silence. And Deborah? She felt lighter. Each step she took through the dining room carried a new purpose, a new confidence. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her. "You're incredible," an older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man added. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validations. Validations of everything she had worked for. Everything she had dreamed of becoming. Leonard, however, was not so gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her. His expression teetered between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he muttered, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. Her voice was calm, but firm. "It was never about proving anything to you," she said. "I just wanted to play." Leonard had no response. For the first time all night he had nothing to say. He fidgeted with his drink, the once commanding presence he carried reduced to an awkward shuffle. He scribbled his signature on the check, avoiding her gaze. And then, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah. "You were amazing. Truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. And for the first time that evening she saw a flicker of humanity in a group that had seemed so far removed from it. But the night wasn't about Leonard anymore. It was about Deborah. She had walked into work that evening as a waitress. She would leave as something more. The younger man's words lingered in Deborah's mind longer than she expected. She had written him off as shallow, just another follower in Leonard's orbit. But his sincerity had been real. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Leonard and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. That night, the tips had been unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for the piano lessons she had been postponing. As she locked up the restaurant and walked home, the crisp night air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist. And nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not fear, could take that away from her. Her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They were on the future. Because for the first time her dreams felt closer than ever. Deborah sat at the worn wooden bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine. But it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night, something had shifted within her. Not just a moment of triumph, but a realization. Her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers. And it was enough. In the days that followed, Deborah's performance at La Fontaine became something of a local story. Patrons who had witnessed her play shared the tale, and soon word began to spread. And then, a phone call. A man who had been dining that night introduced himself. He was a music producer, visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but he was offering something just as valuable. A chance. A chance to record a demo. A step forward, toward something she had only ever dared to dream of. Deborah agreed. Not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she was no longer afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth. Her resilience and authenticity weren't weaknesses. They were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, for all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she had silenced him, with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Deborah's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Leonard Graysons, people who project their insecurities onto others just to feel powerful. But true power? It comes from staying rooted in who you are. It comes from letting your passion speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on, because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now. If Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph, because your story could be next.